Okay, YouTube is telling me that it's working and we are live on YouTube. If it doesn't work or if it crashes, not to worry, this meeting is being recorded and we will post it on the budget website in the next few days. Share my screen and we'll get started. So we'll give folks still a few more moments to come in, but feel free to look over our meeting code of conduct.
Karen, I think you're on mute.
Good, I'm on mute. So welcome to the meeting. Please review the code of conduct. We will have a 20 to 30 minute presentation followed by a Q&A session. Feel free to use the Q&A chat box during the meeting, and we will answer written and verbal questions at the end of the presentation. This meeting is being recorded and you'll be able to watch it again on VTA's YouTube channel in the next few days when we have a chance to post it. I'm going to launch a quick demographic poll. Please take a look at that. If you're joining us on your phone, this poll will take over your whole screen. But it only has 5 questions, which are optional. Feel free to answer those while we get started. Our 2 presenters tonight are Kathleen Kelly, our interim CFO, and Franklin Wong, our Deputy Director of Finance, Budget, and Program Management. If by chance we run out of time and cannot get to all of the questions tonight, the typed questions in the Q&A box will be saved for us, and we will go back through those later to email you your response. So there's no need to panic, but we will try to take turns between folks who raise their hand and the written questions. And I'll also answer questions that I can during the presentation. So we'll give a few more, 20 more seconds for the poll, and then we'll get started. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to hand it over to Kathleen Kelly, and we'll start the PowerPoint slides.
Thank you very much. For those of you who have already heard this once or maybe twice, I really feel for you. But because we have some new people, we're going to roll through this again as quickly as we can. So let's go to the first slide. Many of you know that the VTA board approves an operating and capital budget every 2 years. So we refer to it as the biennial budget, and it's effective starting July 1st. This is the year that we'll be getting, we're in the process now for next year's biennial budget. The budget includes funding for the fixed route and paratransit services, but it also has a budget for a congestion management program, which is separate from the VTA enterprise budget, but is included as part of our biennial budget because that's another activity that VTA has. You can see there are 8 independent funds that are included in the VTA budget. A number of those are both operating and capital. I am going to cover the first one, the VTA Transit Operating Fund, and then I'll turn it over to Franklin Wong, who will cover the capital funds. So if we could go on to slide 4. The perennial issue that we have with budgets is this. We have a limited number of resources, but we have an unlimited number of ways that we would want to spend them. Or in other words, we can usually afford to do anything we want to do, but we certainly cannot afford to do everything we want to do. And so the budget is all about making choices, and that's what you'll see some of those laid out tonight. Let's go on to the next slide. This highlights the things that you'll see in the budget. Number one, we will be increasing transit service gradually back to pre-pandemic levels during fiscal year 2022. And I will say that we have had some meetings since the budget workshop where we're looking to see where we could do that more quickly. We will be maintaining the current staffing level. There's no proposed change in the current fare structure, and the budget continues to support VTA's strategic plan. So let's go on to the next slide. This is a quick summary of the service levels, and you can see 2019 was the last year that we had kind of a normal year. Right at the beginning of, right before the pandemic, we instituted the new transit service plan, NTSP, and you can't see in here that those numbers were there and it was effective for the first 4 months. But what you can see is that we quickly decreased service, both service miles and service hours when the pandemic started. And those numbers stayed low all of this year. We're proposing to bring that back next year, and by fiscal year 23 to be operating at 100% service levels again. Now let's go to the next slide. We'll look at ridership. Here's what you can see again in fiscal year 19. That was the last normal year that we had. The fiscal year 20, we see the last few months there where the ridership dropped off. And then in column E, you see where we expect to end this year, which is really only about a third of where we were in 2019. Even though we will bring service levels back to 100% next year, we do not expect ridership to be able to come back that quickly, and that's a trend we're seeing really across the region. There are a lot of unknowns as we head out of the pandemic. Let's go to the next slide, please. So I want to turn to talking about the revenues in the VTA enterprise budget. For next year, you can see we're projecting about a total of 514 million in revenues and almost 530 million the following year. What's key about the pie chart here, you can see that there are 2 slices that are in red, and those are the only parts of our revenue stream that are not related to sales tax. Everything else is related in some way, meaning that we have close to almost 90% right now that's related to sales tax. And the problem with sales tax is that when times are good, all those revenues go in the same direction. They go up. In down times, they go down, and sometimes they plummet. So that's a real vulnerability that we have with our budget. Let's go on to the next slide. Just a couple of the highlights related to the revenues. I've pointed out that over 85% of our operating revenues come from sales tax related revenues. There are 5 different sources. Those sales tax did decrease this year since the pandemic. For the next 2 years, we're using rather conservative growth projections, rely on 3 of those sources, and the other 2 we're using projections from the Metropolitan Transportation Commission. And the reason that we're using relatively conservative estimates, and it's, when I say relatively, if you look at our first year, we're assuming almost 14% growth. That's not normally a conservative number, but there just are so many uncertainties coming out of here, and that's why we're using relatively conservative projections. Let's go on and we'll look at expenses. So here are the proposed expenses for next year, and you can see that over 80% of our expenses are for delivering service, which is not a surprise. That's what we are supposed to do. We have a small amount for contracted service, and most of that is for paratransit. And then I do want to note the transfer to capital reserve for 8%. And when Franklin gets to his part of the presentation talking about the VTA enterprise capital, this is where that funding comes from, and it's largely to match other outside funding that requires a local match, or for capital projects that we are unsuccessful in getting outside funds for. So that big piece of the pie, service delivery, I want to go to the next slide and break that down a little bit. So of the service delivery costs, almost 75%, 3/4 are related to labor. And of course, that's not surprising. It's labor intensive, especially for a bus agency. You have an operator in every bus. So that's the major portion of our costs. We have materials and supplies. That includes buses, parts on the bus. We have fuel and traction power. That's the power to get the buses and light rail going. We have security. And then we have kind of an other category that includes everything else. Professional services, variety of costs are in there. Let's go to the next slide. Just a couple of the highlights here related to labor costs. I want to be clear that this does not include the potential impact of any upcoming labor negotiations. All 4 of our collective bargaining agreements will expire before the end of calendar year 2022. So we have not assumed anything there. After those agreements are negotiated, we will go back and amend the budget. The pension and retiree health contributions are based on the latest data that we have from our actuaries. And then the total number of positions is 2,361. It includes 4 new janitor positions. Moving on to slide 13. Here you can see for each year, we have both the revenues, which are on the left side in green, and the expenses on the right side in blue. We start with the last year, that's the actual for fiscal 20, and then the current projection for this year, and then the fiscal year 22 proposed and 23 proposed. Those are the 2 years in the biennial budget. At the top of each of the 2 columns, you'll see what's the operating balance. And in all cases, it's a negative number, meaning our expenses are higher than our revenues. So in last year, which closed at the end just about a year ago, we had a shortfall of a little over $5 million. For the current year, our projection is about a $35 million shortfall. For next year, about $7 million, and the following year, $15 million. This does not include the federal relief fund that we've gotten so far, and that's really how we will be able to bridge those budget gaps. Let's go on to the next slide. Here's the 10-year projection. The line on the bottom, which is always lower, are the revenues, and the line on top are the expenses. You can see where we are in fiscal year 22. That's the number that I showed on the prior page, estimating that we'd have about a $7 million shortfall. That grows by the time we get to fiscal year 31 to close to $50 million annually. This would not be a sustainable 10-year projection. The way we are are planning to bridge this is to use the federal funds that we've already received through CARES and CRISA, but under this projection, they would be exhausted by fiscal year 2028. So obviously we have to get, regardless of the federal funding to bridge for a while, we have to get this revenue picture back in line. And this is different than it was, the graph looked 2 years ago. At that time, our expenses, the way we had projected them, those have come to fruition. They are pretty much in line with what we had projected, but what has really changed is the revenues side of the equation, which due to the pandemic, we're starting at a much lower point. And the question is, how soon or will we ever catch up with that? So if we can go to the next slide. Just summarizing the risks here in the biennial budget, as I mentioned, it doesn't include the impact of labor negotiations, and we know that that will increase costs, we just don't know how much. I talked about the economic volatility, especially on the sales tax side, but there's also volatility and some unknowns in things like diesel fuel prices and utilities, healthcare and pension costs. We're seeing a little bit more stability than we did a few years ago, but those are still areas where we do see spikes. And then the last, really the unknown is the transit ridership and the impact that that will have on fare revenues. So that's the summary of the VTA operating budget. I'd like to turn it over to Franklin to talk about the VTA capital program and actually some other capital programs as well.
Thank you, Kathleen, and good evening, everyone. Let's move on to the next slide. The reason VTA needs a capital budget is, of course, to maintain the state of good repair of, a wide array of fixed assets and rolling stock that support, our system service delivery, including stations, bus stops, light rail tracks, our rolling stocks of bus fleet and light rail cars, and the other, safety and technology infrastructure. Next slide, please. Tonight I'm going to quickly go over the 4 major capital programs included in this biennial budget. First is the VTA Transit Fund capital budget. As Kathleen mentioned earlier in this presentation, each fiscal year in the operating budget, we transfer a portion of it to our to our VTA Transit Fund capital program, and for the next 2 fiscal years, we anticipate a little bit more than $75 million to be utilized, to leverage external fund sources to support about 60 projects, under this capital program. Moving on to the next one is the 2000 Measure A program, in which the about less than just shy of 20% of the $2.1 billion appropriation will come from funds from that sales tax measure. And then the third capital program that I want to highlight here is the 2016 Measure B program, and the dollar amount shown here is only covers the formula-based program area. There's another portion of the measure which cover the need capacity-based program areas that are still pending. And last but not least, the 4th major capital program that I'm going over tonight will be the Valley Transportation Plan, also known as VTP, the transportation program of more than $400 million. Next slide, please. All of the numbers that shown on the last slide basically represent planned spending to be incurred or committed in the next 2 fiscal years. And I want to spend, just a quick minute to ensure that, the concept is being explained. The dollar amount of appropriation doesn't mean that, those dollar amounts will be expended in the next 2 fiscal years. Rather, the appropriation allow VTA to enter into contracts of various kinds, should they be construction, professional services, and procurement, to allow capital projects to move forward. In other words, appropriations, they not expire, and for any unspent dollar amounts will be carried forward to between from one fiscal year to the next, and even to subsequent budget cycles. And I also want to emphasize that for the VTA Transit Capital Program, currently is under review by the Capital Program Committee of the Board, pending for the recommendation for board approval. And last but not least, the appropriation included in this proposed budget, if they got approved by the board, all of the appropriations for the 2-year budget cycle will be carried out in fiscal year 2022 to allow programs administration. Next slide, please. So the first program that I'd like to provide an overview is the VTA Transit Fund capital budget. So out of the more than $200 million, these are the 7 categories of projects that this capital program will support, ranging from revenue vehicles and equipment all the way to passenger facilities and IT systems. Next slide, please. This is another way to look at this proposed capital budget. As I've mentioned earlier, about 1/3 of the $200+ million of the proposed capital budget will come from VTA local funds. The rest will come from various sources, such as federal, state, and other fund sources. Next slide, please. Now we move on to the second capital program, which is the 2000 Measure A program. Next slide, please. For the next 2 fiscal years, the proposed budget will include appropriation requests for 2 major capital projects of VTA. They are the BART Phase 2 extension to the Silicon Valley and the East Ridge light rail extension. And I want to emphasize that out of the $2.1 billion of appropriation requested here, only a little bit more than $400 million of 2000 Measure A funding. The rest come from federal, state, and other fund sources. For BART Phase 2, it will be the Regional Measure 3 funding pending. And for the East Ridge to the light rail extension project, it will be the Local Carbon Transit Operations Program, LCTO. Next slide, please. This is another way to look at this capital budget in terms of funding sources. Once again, it's just shy of 20% of the total appropriation will come from 2000 Measure. Now we move on to the third major capital program. Next slide, please. Which is the 2016 Measure B program. As I've mentioned earlier, the program budget, in terms of the appropriation, they will be carried forward and do not expire if there's any appropriation not being spent in the fiscal year 22 and 23 budget cycle. And the dollar amounts shown on this slide, just like in previous slides before, they reflect the programming and allocation approved pending for the May board meeting for the formula-based program areas. For the other program areas, aka need capacity based, they will be considered by board of directors for the review and possible approval later on in 2020. Next slide, please. I want to spend a minute to go over this another major capital program, which is the BTP. Again, it stands for Valley Transportation Plan Transportation Program, which supports the planning and completion of these 4 major project areas, as shown on this slide. Next slide, please. And this slide provides us more details about the dollar amount that we proposed in this capital budget to support the 28 projects under this 4 categories. And I want to point out that out of this 28 projects, 9 of them actually will be deferred because the share of the 2016 Measure B funding is actually going to be reviewed further by the board under the need capacity based program area, 2016 Measure B program. So the total dollar amount that will be brought forward to the board for the consideration and possible adoption at the June board meeting will be different. Next slide, please. And this pie chart allows us to take a different look to the capital budget. And as I've just mentioned a second ago, the 1/3 share of the proposed 2016 Measure B will be significantly reduced because a lot of those will come from the need capacity-based program areas, which will not be available for the board's consideration and adoption in the June board meeting. Now, I want to spend a minute to go over, on the other major chunk of the fund sources for this capital program, which are the other fund sources. On the right-hand side of this slide, which is a tabulation of these other fund sources, ranging from State Senate Bill 1, county and cities in the Santa Clara County, private parties, as well as financing. Next slide, please. So I also want to spend several minutes tonight to go over various programs included in this biennial budget. First of all, apart from the capital program, there's also an operating budget under the 2000 Measure A program. They are primarily for operating assistance to the VTA Transit Fund and also debt service expenses. And the proposed budget, the bottom line is shown on this slide. And the next program, thank you, is the Congestion Management Program. It is fiscally separated from VTA Transit, funded through assessments to local jurisdictions. And for each year, the member agency fees will be increased by 3.5%. And the proposed budget is pending for the Congestion Management Program and Planning Committee review next month. And they could recommend it for board approval at that meeting. Next slide, please. Another program that is included in this biennial budget is the Transit-Oriented Development Program, which reflects, continuing efforts for transit-oriented development of mixed-use, mixed-income projects. And this program has both an operating budget and a capital budget. And it has its own fund source, which is separate from transit funds and other funds that we have covered so far tonight. Next slide, please. VTA also have a Silicon Valley Express Lane program, which has its own fund. And the budget shown here reflects anticipated revenue and expenses for the expanding operation of the State Route 237 and the US 101 Express Lanes segment. And a portion of this program's net revenues would be set aside for future program expenses. Next slide, please. Last but not least is the 2008 Measure B program, which supports VTA contribution to the BART operations and maintenance of the BART to Silicon Valley extension. And there are 3 elements in this budget. The operations and maintenance cost payment from VTA to BART, VTA's contribution to BART's capital improvement projects, and VTA operating expenses are directly related to the extension. And I want to emphasize that the appropriation for contribution to BART capital improvement projects, if the actual expenses turns out to be lower than what we budgeted, the remaining balance will be carried forward and do not expire. In other words, those funding will be available for future fiscal years. Likewise, for the operations and maintenance costs, if the actual expenses turn out to be lower than what we budgeted, the remaining dollar amounts will stay with the fund. Next slide, please. So Kathleen and myself have gone over, a lot of numbers tonight. So this is like a snapshot of what we have gone over from VTA Transit operating budget all the way to various local sales tax measure and other capital budgets and operating budgets as well. So next slide, please. Here we are. We are at the second of two virtual community meetings. Next slide, please. And in front of us is a meeting schedule in the forthcoming days and weeks for various board standing committees as well as advisory committees. And we're going to present a budget to the board on June 3rd, pending for board's possible adoption. That concludes our presentation, and we are happy to answer any questions.
Karen, if I could just say a few words about the comments that we got at the board workshop, and then some of what we heard at the last community meeting. There's a lot of concern about the pass-ups, which is an issue not specifically related to the budget, but it's an issue that's of concern to everybody right now. And in the last week, we've had a number of internal meetings and meetings talking with the union to see what we might be able to do immediately, not waiting for the beginning of the budget year, to see what we could do to help with that situation. And then we are also looking at what we can do to restore the total number of service hours more quickly than was presented in the budget today and at the workshop. So there will likely be some changes in that area as well when we go forward to the budget in June. And then, as Franklin mentioned, the capital projects that were included in the workshop and in the budget booklet that would rely on Measure B, 2016 Measure B funding from the Need Capacity-Based Program, those will not be included in the budget for June because the board won't take that action. So those are some of the changes that we foresee bringing to the advisory committees and to the board for the June adoption. We also have the questions from last time that were not answered, and many of those I think we'd like to respond in writing because they were complex. They have kind of complex answers. So we'll do that. I think some of the ones that were asked at the last meeting, we actually have covered tonight in our remarks.
Okay, I'm gonna we don't have any questions in the Q&A chat box, but I'll take some verbal questions. Robin, you have your hand raised. Go ahead and accept the unmute.
Hi. Does this work? Can you hear me?
You're a little faint, but I can hear you.
Okay, I'll speak up. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about VTA's internal cost sharing agreement. It seems like VTA Transit is paying for items that are like overhead, like security at River Oaks, roofing at HQ, that other divisions are kind of using as well, like the CMP program or the Express Lane programs, engineers, and so forth. So I was wondering, how do those divisions kind of pay their fair share for the things that are covered in the transit capital budget?
Franklin, do you want to address that?
I can give it a shot. So I believe, Robin, you try to find out, if they are like, whether these programs, divisions are paying their fair share. The quick answer is that, we do take that into consideration, and many of those programs, have a very small staff size, and some of the staff actually work on, other projects as well. So, in cases that they split the time between the different projects. So in terms of the specific capital request you mentioned about roofing, things like that, that's only a very small portion of the capital program, because as our budget booklet shows, our capital program covers a wide area of different capital improvement projects.
If I may follow up just to make sure that I understand this correctly, we're showing a transit deficit while highway engineers live kind of rent-free. Is that, I know it doesn't make much of a difference, I understand that, but I'm a little bit concerned about like showing a deficit in one division when that division is actually covering things for everybody else. And it's not just roofing, servers, security, all these things. So that's kind of where I'm coming from, but I understand your answer. Thank you.
Okay, we'll move on to James. Go ahead and accept the unmute.
Yeah. I guess my main question is, do you have any more, I guess, specific bounds on how much uncertainty there is in both, I guess, both the sales tax revenue and the fare revenue that could come? Because I mean, the deficit for the projected deficit for the next 2 years is, I think, averages out to like $10 million a year, which I presume is well within the bounds of any uncertainty in the sales tax revenue and even just the fare revenue. That's normally a relatively small component, and obviously that uncertainty just gets greater as we go out to that like 2028 horizon that was mentioned. So, are there any specific uncertainty bounds on that?
Your point is well taken. I think there's probably less likelihood that we'll see a major change on the fare side. But on the sales tax side, yes, you're absolutely right. And the uncertainty goes both directions. I think in the short term, because we're using fairly conservative projections, that if we're significantly off, it's more likely to be that revenue comes in higher than what we're looking at. And so the anticipated shortfalls could certainly be within that, in that bounds. When you go further out, what gets to be problematic is that in any given 10-year period, if you look back, sales tax almost always gets to some point where there's a big drop, if it's 2008 or it's, something like that. So when you go further out, the uncertainty is on both ends. But yes, I would agree with you that in the short term, there is certainly a possibility that the sales tax will come in higher in the next 2 years.
Okay, we have a question from Monica. She typed in wanting to know if VTA has planned or budgeted any incentives so that riders will return more quickly. I assume she means because of COVID. And
Monica, maybe you could clarify incentives. So you're talking about incentives to riders? Is that the question?
Yeah.
Yes. We have not built in anything on that. And maybe you're talking about on the fare end. That's perhaps how we could do it. The answer is we have not talked about anything like that. What we're trying to do, our main goal is to get service to the levels. I think that's the most significant component for people in terms of decisions to ride again, is the reliability and the frequency. So that's where we've concentrated.
Okay, Robin would like to know, what is the current balance of the Measure A fund?
I can give it a shot. As of June 30th, 2020, the 2000 Measure A fund balance was almost 394 million.
Okay, currently I don't see any hands and I don't see any questions in the box. So here comes one from James. Did the Measure A operations funding that went to Caltrain get allocated to transit ops or somewhere else?
I can give it a shot. For the 2000 Measure A operating expense, as I mentioned in the presentation, part of it goes to the transit fund. So actually, for every dollar that we collect from the 2000 Measure A sales tax, a little bit more than 20%, 20.75% to be exact, goes to the transit fund budget.
Okay, Robin wants to know, how much is VTA spending on security services, police, sheriff? Is that line 17 on page 16, 24.7 million for the year 2022?
Robin is right on.
Okay, another question from Robin. Why isn't the board currently using the sales tax stabilization fund?
We haven't needed to use the stabilization fund because we got the federal funding through the CARES and CRISA Act. If we did not have that funding, then we would have been using, there are actually 2 reserve funds that are available for VTA, but we haven't had to use those.
Okay, so far it's quiet, no questions.
So the next time that we'll be looking at this, as Franklin pointed out, is at the advisory committee meetings. And if there are changes that we make to the budget for the final budget, we hope to have all of those included in the report, the documents that go forward for the advisory committees. And that's in 2 weeks, if I have my calendar right.
I think you're correct, May 12th and May 13th.
Okay, I've got 2 more questions. We'll do Monica. Is VTA lobbying for federal operations funding on an ongoing basis to reduce the gap and potentially improve service?
I think that's always part of the legislative agendas for most transit agencies. It's been a long time since the federal government has really wanted to get involved with operating assistance, that they've been mainly had a philosophy of making capital funding available and then relying on local and state money for operating assistance. So yeah, I think it's probably a part of an ongoing thing. I don't think we expect that to happen. We are working, there is the infrastructure bill moving forward, which will be capital related, and we are lobbying for projects in there.
Okay. Question from James. How much federal stimulus funding is estimated to be left at the end of this budget cycle? And does that include the funding not yet released by MTC?
The quick answer for the first part of the question is that, with what we projected at this point, it'll be about $110 million of CARES Act and CRISA funding that could remain at the end of this budget cycle if all of the forecasted revenue and expense figures come into fruition. And that number does not include the American Rescue Plan Act, the ARPA funding that has yet to be appropriated through MTC from the federal government.
They are starting those discussions in May and in June. Sometime over the summer, they're expected to release the first tranche of funding, and then maybe not till December for the second tranche.
Okay, Robin says, comparing this biannual budget with the 2021 budget, there is a $14.2 million increase in expected expenses for 2028. Why is that?
I'd have to look out that far. I know that the projections that we had before for fiscal year 22 were almost exactly what we're projecting now. So I'd have to look at what the there may have been a change in the out year projections. Do you know, Franklin?
If I may give it a shot, when in the last budget cycle, when the 10-year projections were done, they were unable to include any collective bargaining increases that were still under negotiation at that time. And all those increases have been included in subsequent budget augmentation that was done in late 2019. In other words, all those increases at the starting point of the 10-year projection done 22 years ago could not be included in that projection. So with the time value of money, basically, all those increases got magnified as we move forward. From that projection to this projection. In other words, now we have the hindsight of being able to include the collective bargaining agreements increases that have been agreed upon between the unions and VTA's management.
Okay, why aren't the vehicle registration fee activities included in the budget? Why are they kept separate?
I can give it a shot as well. I believe this is one of the questions that Robin asked last time. So vehicle registration fees is one of the main revenue sources for our congestion management program. And as we have presented tonight, that is one of the 8 independent funds included in this biennial budget. In other words, that program is funded independently by itself rather than commingling with the other 7 independent funds in this biennial budget. That's why they are being kept separate.
And often those are actually not even the same agency, where you'd have the transit agency being the CMA. So that's VTA is a little different that way from a lot of the other Bay Area transit operators.
Okay, question from John. Why do you suppose MTC is waiting so long to disperse the second tranche? And do you think that strategy helps or hurts VTA?
Well, I think it seems like a long time to us. It's not a long time for them because there are a lot of different, they're not only competing agencies with different needs, but even philosophically, what is most important is something that really the commission has to address. So the way that the staff has set this up, they will start discussing it at the meetings in May, and then I believe in June they want to have a workshop so that the MTC board members can hear directly from the general managers of the various transit agencies, and then they'll start to put some philosophical kind of framework around that and then allocate the funds. It seems like a long time for us, but the agencies that are trying to base their budgets and don't even have enough funding to get through next year are really thinking that it seems like a long time. But it is a regional agency and there are just a lot of different competing needs, and the board only meets, I think, once a month there. So it's just, they've only had it, I think that it's probably been about 2 months since that they've known the exact amounts that were available.
Okay, is the release of ARPA funding likely to trigger any budget amendments? Is there any particular plan for that funding beyond hedging against future deficits?
It likely won't trigger, in our case, a budget amendment because we are able to fund the level of service, the 100% service next year without tapping into those funds. We still have enough money from the prior rounds of federal funding. So we won't need to tap into the new money next year or even the following year. So it's not likely to change, to require a budget amendment. If we were in the position where we were only going to put together a partial year budget, which is what some of the agencies are going to have to do, and then amend later on, that would be a different story, but it's not our case.
And Robin would like to know the total balance of VTA's current debt and the total amount of interest payments budgeted for fiscal year 22-23.
I think that we may have to take that one off and do that in writing, because it's going to take looking at various sources, both on the interest and on the debt. I don't think we can answer that one here.
Okay, for Monica, does VTA have an opinion on what formula for the ARP funding would be beneficial to VTA? Will there be advocacy by VTA around that formula?
The main thing that will help VTA is if most of the money that's available in the San Jose urbanized UZA area is allocated to VTA. There are other operators that are eligible for that, and the decision will be up to MTC how to allocate the funds in our urbanized area. The other operators like Caltrain, AC Transit got some funds last time. They have more urgent needs financially, and so that's the situation that MTC is faced with. The best thing for us is if most of the funding goes to VTA.
Okay, we're getting close to 7 o'clock and I see no questions. I'd like to invite folks to email any questions that you have maybe later tonight or tomorrow to community.outreach@vta.org. And we are happy to answer your questions that way via email. And we do have a few questions from the last meeting and one tonight that we will answer at a later time via email.
Thank you.
So at this
Thank you
time,
very much.
we can conclude the meeting. Thanks everyone for coming. And again, we'll be in touch if you have further questions.